Senator Fifield.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. Here we go again. As with every problem that the current government faces, it's somehow the opposition's fault. Failed border protection policy, that's our fault. Falling consumer confidence, falling business confidence, that's our fault. And here today, with the Parliament's legislative agenda, apparently the government's difficulties are yet again the opposition's fault. And we had an extraordinary press release issued on the 13th of September by Senator Evans, which sought to make that claim. But it was also a pretty disrespectful media release to the Australian Senate, Madam Acting Deputy President. It was headed "Extended Sitting Hours for Senate to Pass Legislation." It said the Senate will sit an extra week and have extended sitting hours for the remainder of the spring session to deal with the government's full legislative agenda. Only problem is there was no proposition at that time before the Australian Senate to do that. The Australian Senate had not considered that particular proposition. Now, I'll give Senator Ludwig credit. He would never show such discourtesy and disrespect to the Australian Senate by issuing a press release of that nature. But it was quite extraordinary. 13th of September, that release issued. Here we are on the 21st of September, actually now, for the first time, having this matter before the Senate to debate. That just goes to show the level of disrespect and the level of contempt that the Leader of the Government in the Senate has for this chamber, that he would put out a press release stating what the Australian Senate was going to do before the Australian Senate had even had the opportunity to consider it. And it was compounded by Mr Albanese, who on September the 12th declared that the upper house will sit an extra week starting on November the 7th. Well, how great is that? The Leader of the Government in the House telling the Australian Senate what it will do. Madam Acting Deputy President, in that press release by Senator Evans, he accused the opposition of delaying tactics, and that's part of the justification which Senator Ludwig canvassed, delaying tactics apparently by the opposition as to why extended hours and an extra week are needed. Well, that is wrong. Pretty obvious point. We are an opposition. This is a House of Review, and we've actually got a job to do to scrutinise legislation, and we're not going to curtail debate because the government doesn't enjoy scrutiny. And let's face it, it's not as though this government has an unblemished record on public administration that it doesn't warrant a bit of decent scrutiny. Senator Evans, in that same press release, said, and I quote, "It's time for the opposition to stop its negative obstruction and start dealing with legislation in a constructive manner." Well, Madam Acting Deputy President, we do. This has been an exceptionally constructive opposition. We routinely facilitate the swift passage of non-controversial and time-critical legislation. In fact, last week, with the cooperation of the opposition, I think it was 14 bills passed through this chamber. This week already we've had 4 bills passed through the chamber, and one of the first items of business today was exempting 4 bills from the cut-off, something which the opposition readily agreed to because we take a practical and a constructive approach to the management of business in this chamber. But there is no obligation on this opposition, or any opposition for that matter, to facilitate bad legislation. There is no obligation on us as an opposition to deny due scrutiny to bad policy. There is no obligation on any party, particularly, to facilitate legislation that seeks to break a solemn election commitment. So the opposition completely rejects the accusations of delaying tactics, of negativity and obstructionism, canvassed in Senator Evans' press release, but also by Senator Ludwig. But there's another point that's important to bear in mind, and that is it's the government's obligation to manage its legislative program within the sitting schedule that it publishes. Now, That sitting schedule, as you know, it's published at the end of each year for the coming year. That's the government's call. They set the timetable, they set the agenda. And we do reject the request for the extension of hours and the extra sitting week, because the government should be able to manage within the hours that are scheduled. Now, that doesn't mean that as an opposition we always will or always have said no to extra hours. The opposition have, on occasion, agreed to extra hours for government business. But the onus is on the government to make the case for a change to the sitting schedule, and they have not done so. So we will be voting against the proposed extension of hours and also the additional week. The government will respond, no doubt, as they usually do, that the opposition doesn't like to sit late, but I think you'd be hard-pressed, Madam Acting Deputy President, to find an opposition that has worked harder than this opposition. And if the government needed more time, well, they should have scheduled extra weeks in the first place. I mean, as I said, they are the government, they scheduled the sitting weeks, and it's their responsibility to manage their legislative agenda within that schedule. But apparently, as I said, again, this is another problem of the opposition's making, if you would listen to those opposite. Now, one of the great lies here is that the government lacks the capacity to properly manage the legislative agenda. I mean, look, they certainly have the ability, I guess, that'd be a better way to put it. They have the ability to manage the legislative agenda, but they lack the capacity, it would seem. But in the House, the government have a governing bloc. In the Senate, the Labor-Greens alliance have the numbers, as we've seen with Senator Brown and his extraordinary declaration today that he's very comfortable with the guillotine being exercised. And we have heard minister after minister over recent weeks declaring how well the parliament is going, how many pieces of legislation have passed the parliament, and there have been many members of the gallery who've cited those ministers saying, well, you've got to give it to the government, they've got a lot of legislation through. But the government can't have it both ways. The government can't say that the parliament is working well, that legislation is flying through the parliament in one breath, and then in the next breath say that the opposition is being obstructionist. It just defies logic to hold those two propositions in contention at the same time. Madam Acting Deputy President, really the crux of the motion that's before us is the government seeking an extra week of parliament. And that week is being sought for one reason and one reason alone. It is being sought because of the carbon tax. And I've got to tell you, Madam Acting Deputy President, the opposition feel absolutely no compunction to accede to this request. The proposition that the government is putting to the Senate for an extra sitting week, the proposition is essentially that the Senate should be complicit in facilitating the government to break a solemn commitment to the Australian people. That's really what this motion is about. They're asking the Australian Senate to be complicit in facilitating a lie. And the opposition will not be complicit in that venture. We will say no. The Prime Minister went to the last election vowing not to introduce a carbon tax. And every Labor member and senator, in fact, has a mandate. They have a mandate to not introduce a carbon tax. Madam Acting Deputy President, there could be nothing clearer. Senator Ludwig, in seeking to sidestep that particular fact, referred to how long the proposition of putting a price on carbon has been in public debate. He went back to 1994. He said we've been debating this since 1994. I mean, give me a break, Madam Acting Deputy President. I would have thought that the proposition that was before the Australian people, well, in fact, there was no proposition before the Australian people in 1994. The extent to which this matter was in public debate surely would have been a completely different concept. It was something which was barely in the public consciousness. To cite back to 1994 and any public discussion that there might have been as some justification as to why we don't need proper, decent scrutiny in 2011, I thought was a little far-stretched. Madam Acting Deputy President, there is absolutely no rush to get this legislation through the parliament. I have not heard a credible rationale as to why debate on this bill, on these bills, on this package in the Australian Senate should be restricted to 2 weeks. The only rationale I can glean is that it's an attempt to deny appropriate scrutiny. Already we have 19 bills which are going to be corralled into one committee. It's a committee which is stacked. It's a committee which does not reflect the makeup of the Australian Parliament. It's a committee whose deputy chairmanship, against all convention in this place, has gone to the Australian Greens. That is a committee which is stacked. That is a committee, the outcome of which I think is a foregone conclusion. Madam Acting Deputy President, it's bad enough that the government sought to evade the scrutiny of the Australian people at the election. It's bad enough that the government went to the Australian people with a lie. It's bad enough that the government formed office on the back of a lie. The lie, we know it well, that there would be no carbon tax under a government led by Ms Gillard. Does anyone seriously believe, Madam Acting Deputy President, that the Australian Labor Party would have won enough seats to form government with others had they come clean with the Australian people before the election? There's only one answer to that. No, of course they wouldn't have. We all know that, and that's why they fibbed to the Australian people in the first place. I don't think it's a stretch, Madam Acting Deputy President, to call that a form of electoral fraud. Not in a legal sense, not in a technical sense, but in a moral sense. And that electoral fraud is something that the Australian Labor Party will be accountable to the Australian people for, something that the Australian Labor Party will ultimately be answerable for at the polls. But, Madam Acting Deputy President, where we stand today is the place where the government of the day is answerable and is accountable between elections. We know that they fibbed to the Australian people. There's nothing we can do about that here today. But in between elections, this is the place where the government is accountable, and it's in the committees of the parliament as well where there is accountability. Now, having evaded public scrutiny, the least the government should do is to allow the most full-blooded scrutiny and debate in this place. Now, the government's answer to that is, oh, look, what are you complaining about? We're scheduling an extra week, we're scheduling some extra sitting hours. Well, no, not good enough. You had a legislative program, you should have managed within it. This package of bills is so significant that it shouldn't be a matter of weeks which are allocated to it. It should be a matter of months that are allocated. And we've heard from the Greens that this package has got to go through the parliament because of a conference at Durban. A conference at Durban? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not terribly fussed about what whoever is at that conference in Durban thinks. What I care about is what the Australian people think. What I care about is the effect of legislation that passes through this parliament on the Australian people and on their cost of living and on the capacity of business to sell their products and their goods and services. That's what I'm concerned about, not some conference in Durban, not providing an opportunity for the government and the Greens to strut about, waving their legislation, saying, terrific, aren't we great, look at what we got through. That could not be of less interest to me, and it couldn't be of less interest to the Australian people. Durban is an artificial barrier. It's bad enough that the government fibbed to the Australian people. It's bad enough that they formed office on the back of a lie. The very least that this government should do to seek to salvage some dignity is to have a proper full-blooded debate in this place. What they should do is go to the Australian people. What they should do is call an election. But we know they're not going to do that because the result would be clear. They would lose. They would lose. They don't want to present themselves to the judgment of the Australian people. Madam Acting Deputy President, the model for scrutiny of significant economic change is the goods and services tax. And the goods and services tax, I think, was changed for good, unlike the carbon tax. But I would argue that the carbon tax, whether you think it's good or bad, whether you thought the GST was good or bad, that the carbon tax is a much more far-reaching change to the Australian economy than the GST ever was, and as such it deserves greater scrutiny. And the model for scrutiny was the GST under the Howard government. And the contrast between our approach to significant economic change — I won't call it reform because it's not — the contrast between significant economic change under this government and significant economic reform under the previous coalition government could not be different. I mean, firstly, the coalition sought a mandate at an election. We received a mandate. There was no hiding, there was no subterfuge. Having won a mandate, we submitted our legislation to the most searing and searching scrutiny of any legislative package, I think, in the history of this parliament. The legislation sat on the table in the House at that time, the GST package legislation, before it was debated. That's not something which occurred with the carbon tax legislation. After it passed the House and came to the Senate, the GST legislation then spent 5 months. It spent 5 months in Senate committees, not a couple of weeks, 5 months. And after November 25, 1998, when the Senate established the Senate Select Committee on the new tax system, that committee referred issues to 3 separate Senate references committees. So we had, at that time, a total of 4 Senate committees, examining that goods and services tax legislation. We followed a good and a proper process. Introduced the bills, they sat on the table, we didn't rush. The House had hours to debate. We did the right thing. We subjected the legislation to the appropriate scrutiny of the Australian Parliament after having sought a mandate. What the government should do, Madam Acting Deputy President, is they should withdraw this motion for extra hours. They should withdraw this motion for an extra sitting week. They should also discharge the 19 carbon tax bills currently in the House. They should discharge those bills. They should call an election. They should submit themselves, their tax, their legislation, their policy to the judgment of the Australian people. And if they did that, and if they won, I would be the first person to say, fine, bring the legislation on, let's have a Senate committee process. Even then, if they followed that process, I'd still be arguing that there should be a good 5 months of scrutiny in this place for a package of that magnitude. Because even if the parliament as a whole thinks that something is a good idea, that legislation is worthwhile, we still have a role to perform in the Australian Senate, and its committees still have a role to perform, to be a fresh set of eyes, even on legislation for which there is wide agreement. For legislation for which there isn't wide agreement, our role is even more important. That's our job. That's what we should do. Those opposite have made it clear that they have nothing but unbridled contempt for the Australian people. They don't care what they think. In fact, worse than that, they have contempt for what they think, and they want to actively deceive the Australian people. I have never, in my time in professional politics, which was 20+ years, I have never seen an act of premeditated deceit. I have never seen an act of premeditated deceit by a government to the Australian people of this magnitude. Nothing with such premeditation and nothing of this size. Madam Acting Deputy President, we do reject this motion to extend hours. We do reject this motion to allocate an extra sitting week, not because we're against the parliament doing its job, but because the government should be managing within the program that it laid out at the start of the year, and we on this side of the chamber will not be complicit in providing the opportunity for this government to facilitate a lie to the Australian people. This legislation should be taken back to the Australian people, and if by some miracle this government happened to win an election on that basis, then it should be subject to appropriate parliamentary scrutiny. We will reject this motion. This government has failed in its duty to be upfront with the Australian people, and they're failing in their duty to provide proper scrutiny for this package of bills in this place.